We had barely pulled into the driveway when trouble came knocking literally. It was supposed to be a fresh start. My family had just moved into what looked like a quiet, peaceful neighborhood, excited to finally settle down after months of planning. The house was perfect. The weather was calm. And for a moment, everything felt right. Until she showed up. Clipboard in hand, pastel sweater draped over her shoulders like some kind of neighborhood royalty. She marched up with a tight smile and a tone that made it sound like we were already doing something wrong. She introduced herself as the HOA President Karen. Of course, and without even a proper welcome. She launched into a full-blown lecture about community rules, mandatory events, lawn lengths, trash bin placements, and, most bizarrely, an HOA induction day that she expected us to attend. That same afternoon, no time to unpack, no time to breathe, just rules. And the weirdest part, she acted like we had no choice. She said, "Everyone participates, no exceptions. That's how it works here." We politely told her we'd need a bit of time to settle in, but Karen wasn't hearing it. She got more aggressive, started talking about fines, violations, and something about how she already reported us. We didn't even know what we were being reported for. The next thing we knew, a patrol car slowly rolled up to our curb. At that point, we were all confused and a little rattled, except for Grandpa. He was just sitting on the porch, sipping sweet tea like he'd seen this kind of nonsense before. And that's when things took a turn no one expected. See, Karen had no idea who she was dealing with. Grandpa isn't just a retired veteran, he's a retired general. And when the officer stepped out of that car and spotted him, let's just say everything shifted. But that's where things really started to unravel. Karen had no clue. What was coming next? The officer stepped out of the cruiser looking calm but curious. He glanced around, probably expecting to deal with some simple noise complaint or maybe a parking issue. Karen rushed over to him like she had just summoned backup for a hostage situation. She pointed at our house, at us, even waved her little HOA binder in the air like it was a badge of authority. The officer looked confused, trying to keep up with her rapid-fire complaints about us refusing to participate in the HOA event, violating some made-up rule about neighborhood unity. My parents were trying to stay polite, but you could feel the tension building. My little brother stood behind Mom, clutching his toy robot, not really understanding what was going on. And then there was Grandpa still in his rocking chair, still sipping tea, not a care in the world. But then it happened. The officer looked over at Grandpa, and something changed. His posture straightened just a bit. His tone softened. And then he said, "General Thompson." Grandpa gave a small nod. The officer blinked. "Sir, I didn't realize." Turns out, Grandpa had trained this officer years ago, back when he was still in the reserves. You could see the respect instantly. Karen's face dropped. She clearly didn't expect that. But that didn't stop her. She tried to recover, saying something about how rules still applied, even to people with military history. That's when Grandpa slowly stood up. Not angry, not loud, just calm, steady, and incredibly focused. He walked over, looked Karen right in the eye, and asked one simple question. "What authority do you think you have to enforce anything on private property?" Karen stammered, flipping through her binder. But Grandpa wasn't done. He hadn't even started. And what he said next completely flipped the script on everything she thought she controlled. Grandpa didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just asked Karen to show, in writing, exactly where it said new homeowners were legally required to join the HOA or attend any mandatory events. Her confidence wobbled. She fumbled through a few laminated pages, repeating phrases like community standards and tradition. But when pressed on actual legal grounds, she had nothing solid. Still, she insisted this was how things were done here. Everyone else follows the rules, she kept saying. You don't want to be the kind of neighbors who cause trouble, do you? My dad stepped in then, calmly explaining that our home purchase paperwork didn't include any clause requiring HOA membership. Karen's expression soured fast. She glanced back at the officer for backup, but he had already taken a respectful step back, clearly unwilling to get involved in whatever power play this was. The moment she realized she couldn't use him to force us into line, she muttered something under her breath and stormed off down the sidewalk. But it didn't end there. That night, a few neighbors started acting off. A couple gave us tight smiles that didn't feel very welcoming. Others flat out ignored us. A mysterious note was taped to our mailbox, unsigned, saying it's better to go along than make enemies. My mom was unsettled, but Grandpa just chuckled and said, "The louder they get, the more you know they're bluffing." Meanwhile, we started hearing whispers. Apparently, Karen's power in the HOA wasn't as solid as she made it seem. There were stories, quiet ones from long-time residents, about how she took over the board years ago and slowly pushed anyone who questioned her out. One man even told Dad in hushed tones that Karen had rewritten parts of the HOA charter without a proper vote. He wouldn't say much more. Said it was safer to stay quiet. But Grandpa wasn't wired that way. And now he was digging into property laws, HOA bylaws, even public records. And the deeper he looked, the more cracks started to show in Karen's perfect little kingdom. It didn't take long before Karen realized something was shifting. She noticed the neighbors who used to nod along with her were suddenly quieter around her. One or two even waved at us when she wasn't looking. Grandpa's digging had stirred something up, and word was starting to spread. Turns out a lot of people had questions they'd been too afraid to ask for years. But Karen wasn't about to give up control that easily. The very next morning, we woke up to a notice taped across our front door in red lettering. Non-compliance, immediate review pending. No signature, no official seal, just a cheap scare tactic. Grandpa took it down without a word, folded it, and slipped it into a folder he was building, full of what he called patterns of abuse. Mom was nervous, and Dad kept saying, maybe we should just lay low. But Grandpa, he was in full mission mode. She's bluffing, but bluffers can be dangerous when cornered, he said. That afternoon, a group of board members showed up unannounced at our front yard clipboard brigade in full force. Karen led the charge, claiming we were under review for non-cooperation and community disruption. She started listing off supposed violations. Everything from a misplaced garden hose to our front porch light being too bright. It was laughable. But the real kicker? She said the board had scheduled a formal hearing in front of the HOA to determine whether we'd be fined or get this evicted. The air was thick with tension. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains. A few stood nearby, pretending to walk there. Dogs, but clearly trying to catch every word. Karen's voice rang out, smug and confident, like she'd already won. She thought this was the final move, the one that would send us packing. But Grandpa stood his ground, calm as ever, holding that growing folder like a weapon. Then he said something that made Karen flinch. He said, "Before your little hearing, I think you should take a look at the cease and desist letter that's coming your way." And just like that, everything froze. Karen's confident smile faltered for a brief second, but she quickly masked it with a forced laugh. "A cease and desist? What are you talking about?" she snapped, trying to keep control. In front of the gathering neighbors and board members. Grandpa's eyes didn't leave hers. He pulled a neatly folded envelope from his folder and handed it to my dad, who passed it to Karen. The tension in the air was so thick you could almost cut it with a knife. Karen hesitated, then tore the envelope open. Inside was a formal letter from a law firm, one that specialized in HOA disputes and property rights. The letter outlined serious accusations, unauthorized changes to HOA bylaws, intimidation tactics against homeowners, and most damning of all, threats of unlawful eviction. The letter warned that if Karen and the board didn't immediately cease their harassment of our family, legal action would be taken. Gasps spread among the neighbors. Some exchanged worried glances. Karen's face went pale, her voice dropping as she muttered, "This can't be real." But Grandpa remained calm, his voice steady as he said, "It's very real. And if you want to keep this neighborhood peaceful, I suggest you rethink your approach." Just then, the officer who had come the day before quietly stepped forward. He handed Grandpa a folded piece of paper, a complaint that had been filed against Karen herself from another homeowner who claimed similar harassment. It was a small rebellion, but a rebellion nonetheless. Karen looked around. Suddenly surrounded, not just by us, but by neighbors who no longer seemed so willing to turn a blind eye. The power she had wielded so easily was slipping through her fingers, and you could see the panic starting to rise behind her eyes. But what no one saw coming was what happened next. A car pulled up, and out stepped a stern-faced woman in a suit, carrying a thick folder. She introduced herself as a representative from the county's Property and Housing Department. She'd been investigating complaints about the HOA's legality, and she wasn't there for a friendly chat. The woman in the suit cleared her throat, her presence commanding immediate attention. She explained that the county had been quietly investigating multiple complaints against the HOA, complaints about overreach, unauthorized rule changes, and intimidation tactics. After a thorough review, the county was preparing to revoke the HOA's authority to enforce any new rules until a proper election and legal review could be held. Karen's face drained of color as the official laid out the consequences. Not only would the forced inductions and fines be nullified, but any previous actions taken without proper legal backing would be invalid. The board's power was effectively frozen. The neighbors exchanged relieved, hopeful glances, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. Grandpa stepped forward, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "This neighborhood belongs to its residents, not to anyone trying to control it unfairly. We're here to build a community, not to be bullied into silence." His words seemed to breathe new life into the crowd. Karen tried to argue, tried to grasp at any remaining shred of control, but it was clear she had lost. As the officials continued to explain the next steps, elections, transparency, and new oversight, Karen's shoulders slumped, defeated. Just when it felt like the storm was finally passing, the unexpected happened. As the crowd began to disperse, a neighbor stepped forward and handed Grandpa a small envelope. Inside was a single, cryptic note: "This isn't over. Watch your back." The calm after the chaos was deceptive. We had won this battle, but the war to protect our home and our family was just beginning. Karen's grip on power may have been broken, but the shadows she left behind hinted at challenges we hadn't yet seen. And with Grandpa quietly pocketing the note, we realized that standing up for what's right sometimes means facing what you least expect, because in this neighborhood, nothing stays buried for long.